I tried on the dress last night and I hated it. Well, hey there, it's Liz. It's been way too long, but I'm back with a wedding guest dress project. I had a limited amount of time to sew this dress and I was a little bit paralyzed with indecision, but a big shout out to my friend Laura who helped me pick out this pattern, Butterick 5708. It's a reproduction pattern from 1953, and she was so kind enough to go on my Pinterest in my dresses and suggest this one. And I was like, you know what? This is the one. I'm gonna make this dress. I've had it in my stash for a long time. Now it's time to shine. It didn't take too much fabric, and it was only 5 pattern pieces, and like I said, I had a limited amount of time, so I wanted something that wouldn't be too complicated. So the cool thing about this pattern is that the shoulder ties are convertible, and as you can see, there's all these different ways you can tie the ties. I don't know that I will be tying them any different ways personally, but it is something you can do if you want to. So for the pattern, I did have to add a little bit to the waist and the bust, so I ended up doing a full bust adjustment. And allow me to show you what I did with this nifty little animation. Starting with the size 14, I added 1/4 inch to each side, front, and back of the waist bodice pieces to give me a full extra inch at the waist. For the bust, I determined I needed an extra 4 inches total, so I decided to add 3 inches to the front and 1 to the back. I made a diagonal slash from the bust to the seam line, and then another small one from the seam line through the seam allowance, basically making a pivot point at the seam line. That way the neckline seam will be the same length as it was originally drafted to be. Doing the same on the other side gives us a total of 3 inches increase for the bust. I repeated the idea in the back, but this time only adding 1/2 inch per side. I didn't do anything to the skirt as it's just a gathered, almost rectangle. After I made all the adjustments, it was time to cut out everything and get sewing. This fabric is a cotton rayon blend from Joann, and it's pretty frayy, so I decided to serge any raw edge I could, including ones that would be encased in the lining. So here's a tip for sewing with plaids or stripes that you want to match up. Use a glue stick to stick your pieces together before stitching. It will wash out with water and detergent, and your plaids will be matched. Okay, so on to the sewing. Construction of this dress is pretty simple. You sew the lower bodice pieces together, stopping at the upper dots. And then you sew some stitching lines between the dots to ease or gather the upper bust piece at the bust. Then sew it to the lower bodice, matching up your notches and dots. You repeat the same procedure for the back, minus the gathering. Sew the bodice front and back together at the left side seam. Next, sew the gathering lines for the skirt. I like to sew 1/8 inch on either side of the 5/8 inch seam line. That allows you to get a really nice, even gather. Sew the front skirt panels together and then the back ones together. Then, sew the skirt together at the right side seam. Next, gather the skirt pieces to fit the bodice, matching the front, back, and side seams. Pin and sew the skirt to the bodice. Double stitch, meaning make another stitching line just outside of that one, or serge the raw edges. This gives the skirt a little bit more security. Now it's time to install the zipper. It's very important to iron your zipper's teeth a bit flatter at a low heat setting when you're using an invisible zipper. That will prevent you from sewing into the teeth, and it will allow for a closer stitch. Pin one side of your zipper to your bodice. Make sure you place the top of the teeth 5/8 inch below the edge of the fabric. Stitch. Then carefully repeat for the other side. After stitching the zipper in, continue sewing the side seam from the hem to the bottom of the zipper, making sure that there aren't any gaps. Next comes the lining. This is constructed the same way as the bodice, just make sure you're leaving the other side seam open because it is reversed for the zipper. Once you're done with that, sew the dress together along the ties and the neckline. Check your bobbin before you do this. It's a pretty long seam all the way around. After you've stitched it, serge along the seam, or pink or overcast. Next comes the turning and pressing. Carefully massage and press the neckline and ties out flat. Understitch along the neckline in the front and the back. This will prevent the lining from flipping up and being visible when you wear it. At this point, I tried on the dress and I'm gonna throw it to Past Liz to talk about that. Take it away, Past Liz. Hey, so I thought I would kind of give you a update. I tried on the dress last night and I hated it. I tried it on with a white belt, but it just I felt like it looked terrible. It just wasn't flattering. It was way too big. I underestimated how much the bias would allow for, more room in the waist, basically. But I did manage to come up with a solution that I think I'm happy with. So I basically made a little self belt really quickly out of some scrap fabric, and it looks a lot better. I think the problem with this fabric is that it's a delicate feeling fabric, but it does have some weight to it, and because the whole bodice is cut on the bias, it's just too much for this fabric to handle, so it weighs down. Something to consider when you're making this pattern. Definitely do a tester. But anyway, I am now going to cut off about 2 inches on the hem, also because it drags down so much. It's actually longer than it should be. It hits kind of mid calf for me, and I want it just a little bit shorter. So I'm gonna just serge it, and then I'm going to press that up and then roll it up again and then stitch that with my machine. Should just be a really simple little rolled hem. And then after that, I just have to hand sew in the lining, and it's done. Well, you heard her. So this pattern calls for a narrow hem, so if you want it to be quite a bit shorter, you will have to chop off some at the bottom. Hand sew the lining to the bodice at the side seam and waist seam. I finished mine on the plane and at the airport. My plane was actually delayed by like an hour, so I ended up finishing the whole thing sitting there before we even took off. And then I got to watch Netflix. My mom and I had a great time at the wedding in Kentucky. It was a little hot, but the dress actually held up really well and it was comfortable. And actually I got a few compliments on it, which was really nice because I got to say, oh, thanks, I made it. If I made this dress again, I would probably lower the armpit a little bit just because it was kind of hiking up into my armpit. I would also probably take out the excess that I had added to the waist just because with the bodice being cut on the bias, I just didn't need it. It added a lot of extra stretch. I think this is going to be a great sundress just for the summer, for sightseeing and going out to dinner. I really recommend this pattern. I mean, it's so easy. It's just 5 pieces. It just takes a little bit of patience with the gathering. So if you decide to make it, then please post it on Instagram or in my Facebook sewing group, which is Vintage Sewing with Liz, and then tag me so I can see what you've made. I love that. Oh, let me know if there's any patterns that you are interested in watching me make. I'm open to suggestions. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. And it won't be so long next time before you see me again. Take care. Mwah. Bye. All right, hot mess, but we're back on the horse.